All right, so up until this point in the course, we've focused on very executional activities like creating a schema, creating a table, altering that table, adding rows, updating rows, deleting records. So I wanted to start with all of that executional stuff just so you could very quickly start to get your hands dirty and actually be playing with data. But now I want to take a step back, move up to a little bit of a higher level, and talk about the more strategic concept of database design. So when we talk about database design, we're going to be talking about how we want to structure our data, how we want to build a database that can handle scale and that can store data efficiently, that can be queried easily so that we can pull out the information that we need when we need it. It could feel like these concepts are slightly more difficult to grasp, but we'll try to go through them pretty slowly and in a step-by-step way so that we can get you up to speed on the whole world of database design. So first of all, this is a look at structuring tables and the relationships between those tables. So this is an example of the Maven Movies database. This is the database that we use in our beginner SQL course for data analysis. It contains data on customers, business activity, and inventory. And so what you see here, each of the rectangles represents a table, and those tables relate to other tables. The way that that relationship happens is by the overlap of the same column, which is a primary key in one table and a foreign key in another table. So for example, in the film table, the first column that's listed in that table is film ID. So that's the primary key of the film table. And then if you look over to the right in film category, you'll see that film ID is also in that table. And in this case, that's going to be a foreign key, which allows us to join the film category table to the film table. Same thing if you look down below in the inventory table, you also see that that contains the film ID column. And again, that's going to be what allows us to join the inventory table and the film table. So when we see an item with film ID equals 5 in the inventory table, we know that's talking about the same film as a record that has film ID equal 5 in the film table. Let's zoom in a little bit to individual tables and talk about that. Some of this is going to be potentially review for you, but I still think it's good to build from the ground up. So here is a representation of one table, the rental table. And we can see the actual data in that rental table. We've already talked about this a little bit, but your tables are going to contain information that's organized into columns, aka fields, and rows, aka records. In the case of the data that's displayed here, the rental table contains 7 columns and 10 rows, or 10 records. Each column is going to contain one attribute related to the film rentals. For example, the rental ID, the return date, the customer ID of the customer who rented it, the staff ID of the staff member that rented it out to them. And then each row is going to correspond to one specific rental that happened for the business. So those rows are populated with data that tell us everything about that rental. So in this case, the column rental ID, this is the primary key of the table, which we'll get into more in a moment. And it creates a unique identifier for each rental that happens for the business. And then each of those rentals will create an entire record. So for example, here, the 4th rental for the business was rented at that time on May 24th, 2005. It was the inventory item 2452. It was rented by customer 333. It was returned on June 6th of 2005. It was rented out by staff member 2, and the record was last updated at this timestamp here, which appears to be shared by a lot of the records. So hopefully this is just a review for you. We've already been working with tables, but I think this is still going to be just a good framework to really build from the ground up for anybody who is new to this stuff. So next, let's talk about table relationships and cardinality. So when we say cardinality, we're referring to the uniqueness of values in a column, and this is commonly used to describe how two tables relate to each other. So the types of relationships that we have are one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many. For now, here are a few key points that you should grasp. In this inventory table, we have a foreign key of film ID, which can have the same value many times. So you see film ID of 1 is shown here 8 times, as inventory items 1 through 8 are all the first film. They're the same film held in inventory 8 times. And then we can use the foreign key here to relate to the primary key in the film table. When a column is the primary key, we're only going to see one instance of a value in that entire column. So in this case, we talk about the film table and the inventory table as having a one-to-many relationship. So that film ID value of 1 will only occur once in the film table, but it'll occur many times potentially in the inventory table. Next, we have another foreign key here in the inventory table, which is the address ID. So again, if we just focus on those first 8 records in the inventory table that are all film ID 1, we see some of those are at address ID 1 and some are at address ID 2. So that's just because some of those inventory items are stored at store 1 and some are at store 2. And again, the foreign key maps to the primary key of the address table. This is a one-to-many relationship where the address ID will never repeat in the address table. So when you know the address ID, you know exactly which row you're talking about in the address table. But address ID could occur many times in the inventory table because you can have multiple inventory items stored at the same address. So important things to remember here, your primary keys are always going to be unique. They can never repeat. So there's only going to be one instance of a value in that column. And this is really important because it helps us uniquely identify the record that we're talking about. Foreign keys are non-unique. So they can repeat the same way that we saw the film ID and the address IDs repeat in the film table on the left. There will be many instances of the same exact value in that foreign key column. We'll create a one-to-many relationship by connecting a foreign key in one table to a primary key in another. This becomes really important in the relational database model. This one-to-many relationship is what allows us to store robust information in a pretty efficient way. So in the case of storing film data in the inventory table, instead of having to store the title Academy Dinosaur over and over again, the release year, and all of this other data that we want to store about the films, we don't have to store that in the inventory table. All we have to store is the film ID of 1, and then we can link back to the film table, which only stores that information one time, even though we have many inventory items of that film. I know this might be kind of a lot of information, so you might want to watch this video again. The most important things that you want to take away from this lecture are that a database is going to be made up of multiple tables which relate to each other using primary and foreign keys. Each of those individual tables is organized into columns. Each column represents a certain attribute, and each record represents one instance of a given concept, which is populated with values in individual columns and tells us everything that we need to know about that record. Like I said, you might want to watch this lecture again. Hopefully this stuff all makes sense.